My wife, Gwen, told me she was flying out of town for work for a couple of days, a deal she had to close in another city. But the next day, her coworker looked confused and said they didn't have any out-of-town deals. That's when I realized my wife had lied to me. On that hot afternoon, my friend Blake and I decided to stop by a local car dealership in Naples. He was looking for a new car, and I just came along to help him choose. My wife worked there as the head of the sales department, so I figured she could help Blake pick a good model and get a good deal. While Blake was checking out the features of a shiny new car in the showroom, I went to find Gwen and ask her to help us out personally. Her office was on the second floor of the dealership. It was a sleek, all-glass cube on the second floor, with a full view of the entire showroom below. I walked up the stairs and opened the door, expecting to see my wife smile. But she wasn't there. The only person sitting at the desk was Davis Murphy, my wife's coworker and one of her employees. Davis glanced up at me from her monitor. She gave me a friendly, polite smile and offered me a seat while I waited. She said Gwen had stepped out for a bit and should be back any minute. I nodded and sat down in Gwen's soft leather chair. On my wife's desk, I saw a fancy basket of fresh white orchids. Next to the flowers, right on top of a stack of documents, sat a signature turquoise Tiffany box, slightly open. Inside, on a black velvet cushion, was a delicate, thin white gold bracelet. The first thought that crossed my mind was that maybe they were getting ready to congratulate one of the top managers. I asked Davis, "Is it someone's special day in management today? Did everyone chip in for a gift?" Davis raised her eyebrows in surprise, looked up from her papers, stood, and walked over to Gwen's desk. She looked closely at the box and said, "Beautiful piece. Someone clearly wants to impress your wife." I was stunned and asked her again, "So this is a gift for Gwen? But what's the occasion for something this expensive?" Davis didn't say anything else. She turned around, sat back down at her desk, and went back to work in silence. I sat there for a couple more minutes, quietly moving my eyes from one corner of the office to another, listening to the steady clicking of keys. Blake was waiting for me downstairs, so I couldn't wait for my wife much longer. I stood up, said goodbye to Davis, and told her I'd go look for Gwen in the showroom. "Check the conference room. It's on this floor too, a little further down the hall. She might be in there with a customer." I nodded and headed for the conference room. The hallway was empty and quiet. Just the low hum of the air conditioner and faint voices coming up from the showroom below. There were framed photos on the walls, the dealership team at some corporate event, handshakes, smiles, awards. I walked slowly, glancing at the doors on both sides. The conference room was at the very end, a wide door of dark glass, slightly ajar. I stopped in front of it and looked inside. The room was dim because the blinds were shut tight. Cold air drifted out from the AC. I figured no one was in there and was about to leave. But then a faint rustle came from deep inside the room. Someone was whispering. I froze at the door, trying not to make a sound. The gap between the door and the frame let me see almost the entire conference room. At the far end, behind a long meeting table, sat Gwen. Across from her was a man in a light shirt. Between them lay an open folder of documents, a few pages spread across the table, a laptop, and a pen beside them. From where I stood, it all looked like a regular business meeting. They were calmly going through papers, quietly discussing something now and then. The man turned another page, then leaned forward a little, as if he wanted to point out something in the contract. The next moment, he leaned in even closer. Instead of the documents, his face was right next to Gwen's neck. He slowly breathed in the scent of her perfume, his lips barely touching a strand of her hair. I instinctively took a step back into the shadow of the hallway, so no one could spot me through the open door. "Not here. Please, let's get back to work," I heard her voice clearly. A second later, Gwen calmly, without any sudden movement, leaned back a little from the man. He straightened up right away. Gwen turned her eyes back to the documents, opened the folder, and pointed at one of the pages, as if steering the conversation strictly back to business. The man listened carefully, nodding now and then. Gwen stayed completely calm and focused, never lifting her eyes from the documents. I stood in the hallway a little longer, and then I remembered I'd left my car keys on my wife's desk. I turned around and headed back to Gwen's office. Davis was still sitting at her computer, typing something quickly. She looked up when she heard my steps. I told her I'd forgotten my keys and grabbed them off the desk. On my way out, I asked Davis, "By the way, how's your little one?" All better now? Davis looked at me, clearly confused. My little one. He's fine. Why did you think he was sick? I shrugged, surprised. Well, Gwen said you asked her to cover for you this Saturday because your kid was sick. Davis frowned and said nothing like that had happened. She'd worked her usual shift on Saturday and hadn't asked anyone to cover for her. For a few seconds, there was silence. I realized the story about the sick kid had been made up, which meant Gwen was hiding something from me. Got it, I said shortly and headed for the stairs. I walked down slowly, going over everything from the last few minutes in my head. Each new detail suddenly fit together with the one before it, but I still couldn't see the full picture. That was the exact moment my eyes happened to land on the photos hanging along the wall. In one of them, I immediately recognized the man I'd just seen in the conference room. It was the general manager of the dealership, Colin Breyer, Gwen's boss. Blake and I left the dealership and drove home. The whole way back, I kept going over everything I'd seen. I still had no answers, but the questions just kept piling up. Late that night, when the clock was getting close to 2, a short buzz from my phone on the nightstand woke me up. I opened my eyes a crack. Gwen quickly grabbed the phone and answered, annoyed. I don't know. Probably a wrong number. Right after that, she quietly got out of bed, took the phone with her, and left the bedroom for the bathroom, closing the door behind her. 2 days went by. Around noon, Davis called me out of the blue. She said she urgently needed Gwen's signature on a few documents, but Gwen hadn't been answering her calls for hours. I was surprised and explained that my wife had gone out of town to close a deal and wouldn't be back until tomorrow. The line went quiet. After a few seconds, Davis said, confused, "There's no deal. Your wife took 2 days off. She didn't tell you?" Everything went cold inside me. I called my wife right away. She didn't answer. 20 minutes later, I was in Gwen's office. "What's going on? Is she seeing your general manager?" I asked Davis. She turned noticeably pale. "You'd better ask her yourself. But if you're not a complete idiot, just open your eyes." I suggested we step out of the office and grab lunch at a cafe nearby. We sat down at a table and ordered. And then Davis told me the whole story. It turned out she'd been in a serious relationship with Colin Breyer, the general manager of the dealership. They were even planning to get married, but after Gwen showed up, it all fell apart. According to Davis, Colin fell for my wife, and soon after, the two of them broke up. She also told me that Breyer regularly gave Gwen expensive jewelry, took her to expensive restaurants and hotels, and wrote all of it off as client entertainment expenses for important clients. "Can you prove this?" I asked. Davis nodded firmly. She explained that she processed all the business expenses for their department and knew exactly what those charges were and who they were for. I asked her to pull together the biggest expenses, the ones she was 100% sure about. She agreed. A couple of days later, Davis and I met again after work at the same cafe. She set a thick paper envelope on the table and slid it over to me without a word. Inside were copies of documents. I went through them slowly, one by one. Bills from expensive countryside spa resorts, receipts from high-end restaurants, copies of invoices for jewelry purchases. Every document had signatures and internal company stamps. "Thank you," I said quietly. "This will help me put an end to this whole ugly situation." Davis nodded shortly. I told her I wanted to take these papers to the company's head office and show them to management. Davis said she'd call the secretary herself tomorrow and book me an appointment as a potential business partner looking into a possible deal. The meeting at the head office with the company's director was set for the following week. I spent the whole weekend waiting on edge, running the coming conversation through my head over and over. I knew this visit would completely destroy my old life, but there was no turning back. The following week, on the scheduled day, I arrived at the headquarters of the auto group. The tall, modern building looked just as flawless as the cars their dealerships sold. I walked into the reception area, and the secretary showed me straight into the owner's office. Behind a large desk sat a man in his 50s with a hard, calm look. He greeted me briefly, offered me a seat, and asked right away what I wanted to meet about. I set a thick folder of documents on the desk. "My wife works at one of your dealerships," I began calmly. "She was recently promoted to head of the sales department. Almost right after that, she started showing up with expensive jewelry, regular dinners at fancy restaurants, and trips to countryside spa resorts. I found out about it recently." He listened without interrupting. "And I want you to know about it too." "Why?" Because the person paying for all this is the general manager of that dealership, Colin Breyer. He writes every one of these expenses off as client entertainment expenses. I put the folder of copies right in front of him. The owner opened it and quickly looked through a few pages. For a few seconds, the office was silent. Finally, he looked up at me and said calmly, "I understand. This is an interesting situation. I'll handle it personally. Thank you for letting me know." We shook hands and I left the office. I got in my car, pulled smoothly out of the headquarters parking lot, and merged into the heavy city traffic, knowing for certain that I would never go back to my old life. The next evening, Gwen came home from work noticeably later than usual. She looked tense and started telling me about what had happened at the dealership almost right away. According to her, staff from the head office had shown up first thing that morning. They took over the conference room and started auditing the financial records. And their general manager had been temporarily suspended pending the internal review. I heard her out. Then I added, "Of course, he was spending the dealership's money on his mistress." Gwen froze. She stared at me in silence for a few seconds, as if she couldn't understand what she'd just heard. "What mistress are you talking about?" she finally asked. I kept looking at her calmly. "About you, my dear. About your white orchids. About the Tiffany bracelet. About your dinners at fancy restaurants. About the rooms at countryside spa resorts that you booked as client entertainment expenses." With every word I said, her expression changed more and more. For a few seconds, the house was completely silent. Then she turned around without a word, went to her room, and shut the door behind her. We didn't talk again that night. The next morning, I heard the sound of a suitcase in the hallway. I came out of the kitchen and saw Gwen with several travel bags. She opened the front door, carried her things out to the car, and a few minutes later, she was gone. A week later, Davis called me. She told me in detail how the whole thing had ended. The internal review was finished. Colin Breyer was fired and ordered to fully repay the company within 3 months for all the money he'd spent under the guise of client entertainment expenses. Gwen also lost her position as head of the sales department. She was moved back to a regular sales manager role, and Davis was named the new head of the department. Before finally leaving the dealership, Breyer went up to Gwen's office and demanded she return all the expensive jewelry he'd given her. He said he now needed the money to settle up with the company and clear his debts. But Gwen refused. A loud argument broke out between them. In the end, she pointed him to the door and told